Good morning and welcome to another Thursday with me. My name is JDM, aka Josh David Miller, and this is my weekly office hours about startups and traction, everything from idea all the way to product market fit. And I'm answering your questions every single Thursday at 10 a.m. If you have a question that you want to ask, there's a link in the description. You can hit up this link here and submit a question. You can submit a written question or an audio question or even a video question. If you do submit a video question, I will play it here on the air. You guys have really been liking the text questions lately, though, so I'm feeling a little left out. Haven't had a video in a little while, but let's get to it. Our question of the day here is actually something a little bit more generic. I want you to pitch me your startup idea. So take whatever you're working on today, drop it down into the chat. Tell me what you're working on, and I will come and attack it, shred it, or support it. We'll find out. Find out in the comments how that goes. So let's get to our first question of the day, which comes from a tech founder that I was talking to just a few days ago. And so this is a question. It says, I have an idea for a startup. Now what, right? That's the basic question. And the additional detail was, you keep saying that I have to make small bets to reduce risk, but what does that translate to in the real world? So I have the startup idea, not really sure what to do with it when we start with. And this is actually a really good question, because when we talk about startups in the literature, so if you read any books, if you read the Lean Startup, if you read the 4 Steps to the Epiphany, or any of the many supporting books out there, they're all going to tell you something pretty straightforward, right? You fall in love with the problem and you find a customer that has the problem and you prove that, and then you prove the solution, and then you prove the business model after that, and you find product market fit. And so they draw it as this very linear process, but in the real world, that's not really how we think about startups. So most of the time, not all of the time, but most of the time, if you're a startup founder and you're thinking about, I have an idea for blank, that idea is inclusive of the product. So it starts with, I have this idea for a thing. I think that there's a there, and I want to see if this solution is real. And so then you're like, okay, so now do I reverse engineer that to a problem and then go validate the problem? And yeah, you could do that. You absolutely can do that. In fact, it's a good idea to do that. But we're already starting from the perspective of a solution. We probably have some reason to believe that. So if we can make a small enough bet that's on that path, why not do so? So let's take this question not from the abstract, not from the literature, not from a technical perspective, but say, real world, I got a startup idea. What do I do next? And it's actually pretty straightforward. It's not complicated. So it's a kind of a 4-step process that I basically want to outline here. So the first thing that you got to do, so you have this idea for a startup, and when I say idea for a startup, I'm hearing that as you have a basic understanding of some kind of value proposition that you're going to make to your customer. So you have a particular solution, to a problem that you think that they have and you think that they want it, right? Something at least as basic as that. I want to do an app that kind of thing, right? So assuming you have that, step number 1 is you have to articulate the who and the where. So who is the actual customer for this thing? As an hypothesis at this point, it's all an hypothesis at this point, but you start with the who. And then the second question that you have to answer as part of that is, where are these customers? You have to know who they are and where they are. So knowing who they are is definitely the first step, but if you don't know where to find them, then the rest of this just becomes an academic exercise anyway, because you're going to never get something in front of a real customer. So step number 1, is the who and the where. What are we trying to figure out here? Second question is, you want to create some type of experiment, prototype, test that you can put in front of customers. And what this looks like is a little bit more complicated, and it's going to be based on, what you're trying to do. But here's a couple of examples just to give you the idea. So if you're doing an app and you say that, like, oh, this app is going to deliver this amazing experience that does A, B, and C, then what you probably want to do is do a rapid prototype, Google Slides, something like that shows a few screens, that finds that moment where you think the customer's going to go, wow, and you kind of get to that point, few screens, or if it's not something like that, that it's like, oh, this is actually just a big problem that people have, and if we can solve this problem, that's great. Then maybe it's actually creating messaging, like actually writing down that value proposition and putting it in front of customers in the form of a landing page, a social media ad, or something like that, that maybe even a LinkedIn in-mail or a DM on another social platform, something like that, that you could put in front of a customer. But at the end of the day, you said, I have this idea for a startup, it's for this customer, and here's where I think they can find them. So step step 2 is you have to create something that you can put in front of them, either a rapid prototype or a basic experiment, that kind of thing. If you have a question about what that might be for you, go ahead and drop that in the chat. Happy to dialogue with you about what some of those experiments might be for you. But so that's the second step. The second step is to come up with what the experiment is. The third step is to actually put that in front of those customers. Since we know who they are, where they are, and now we have a thing, we can put that thing in front of the customer and see if we get that result. So if it was that app and we're looking for that, wow moment where the whites in their eyes show up, then that's what we're looking for. And success is, we put this in front of customers and we consistently get that wow moment, right? If it's testing a value proposition in a landing page or a social media ad or an email, we're probably looking at, what is the rate of people clicking the call to action on a landing page? What is the rate of engagement or clicks or swipe ups or whatever it is on the social platform? Or what is the response rate for our in-mail or our DM on a social platform? But we're looking at some measure of success that when we put this thing in front of those customers, we got the result that we anticipated from the start. So that's the third step, right? So who and where, create the experiment, put that in front of real customers. And then step 4 is the obvious one, which is to iterate, because you're probably going to miss it the first time. You might get some interesting data, it might be directional, but you're almost certainly going to miss it. So step 4 is to actually iterate on that until you get to a thing, right? And so that's the basic process. So in the real world, you have a startup idea, it's a thing, I got this value proposition, I want to put it in front of a customer, and see if I'm onto something. And that's just the basic process as you do it. Figure out who is that customer you think, where can you find them, what's the experiment that you can use to test the value propositions you're articulating, put that thing in front of real customers, what happens, right? Do you actually get that result? And then iterate on that until you do. And that's like the first step. Right. And so this is the first step of articulating, like, is there a thing, like, is there a there out in the distance? Is there something that makes me think I'm onto something? Is there vaguely a there? And then you can move into actually building a business around this. And what I mean by that is not a company and not building a startup and not building product, but actually starting to get customers. So once you have a validated thing that, like, it's directionally right, at least, right? It's directionally right. It's over there. Then you can actually start to get customers. So if you're looking at, for example, a B2B play, then this is going to be probably letters of intent or something like that. You're actually going to get in writing customers saying, heck yes, I want this thing. And if you build it, I'll send you a check, right? That kind of thing. Then if you're working on B2C, for example, it's probably different. But, the old cliche is, can you collect a bunch of email addresses? And that's great. Email addresses are totally, totally fine. But if you're trying to look for something a little bit more robust, which I hope you are, then the more data that you collect up front, the better that data is, the more robust the evidence is. So instead of just collecting, their email address, can you collect their email address, their name, their address, their phone number? Can you actually get payment up front? In other words, crowdfund that kind of the process. Right? So what can you do along there to get really robust evidence from customers? Basically, what we're saying is that you want to, before you even build the product, before you even build the startup, you're actually engaging in the process of finding out if customers will buy it by getting that actual evidence that they will. And then once you have that evidence, then it can become time to build product. And if you have that evidence, if you have evidence that there's a thing, customers want it, there's a there, and I have this wait list of customers, I've got LOIs from businesses, or I've got some really robust data from customers, then at that point, you can probably actually get some funding to build the product because there's enough evidence there, but because you don't have just an idea. So when we talk about execution matters, a lot of people think that execution only comes in the form of building product. And that's actually not it at all. Like, that's the last step in execution. The important step in execution is proving that there are customers there. And I'm going to give an example of this because the next question actually kind of ties into that. Before we do, question from Mark. What if the customer doesn't believe there's a problem, but you have lots of data that there is a problem? Well, so those two things can't both be true. So it's not a problem for them if they don't know it's a problem for them. That's the first thing to kind of keep in mind there, right? And so you're articulating that there's a thing, but if they don't know it, it doesn't really matter. It's not really a problem for them. We see this a lot in the case where somebody has a societal problem that they want to solve. And so in order to solve the societal problem, they need customers to engage in behavior, and they don't see the customers don't necessarily see the connection between those two things or care enough about the connection between those two things. And in which case it's not actually the problem that you want to solve. And you have to find another way of like wedging in the door with a different problem that they actually solve. So, but aside from that, right, there are a few other cases where we get a problem that customers can't articulate that they have, but they have it and will see it eventually. So this is where we actually have to trick things a little bit. It's a really good question. If we're talking about that context, Mark, super interesting, super good question, because there's a couple of ways that you can go about it. But the principal idea here is that you really don't want to have to convince people that there's a problem as part of sales, because it's really dangerous, right? Because you have to, your sales are more expensive. Your customer acquisition cost is going to be through the roof. And that's kind of crazy. And so there are two ways that you can, that this can still be viable for this to work. So one way is that you say, okay, most people don't realize that they have a problem because they're late market adopters or mid-market adopters. If you've never read Jeffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm, he talks about this in great detail in the book. It's actually where the term early adopters comes from. Comes from the idea that the market is broken down into these particular stages, right? So you have some really early groups that actually, get engaged in a project. You have innovators and early adopters, and then you have like the mid-market, late market, like the laggards. I think I'm forgetting a category in there, but there's, right? So you have these people that adopt on that curve, and the market adopts on a big curve. So the people who are laggards, for example, those are the people who are still using flip phones. Right. But the people before that, like mid-market and late market adopters, they are not going to realize they have a problem until the rest of the market, or the bulk of the market, or a lot of the market at least, has started to adopt the thing. So they're just not the right people. So then you have to say, okay, I want to set those guys aside because they're going to be expensive sales if I sell them at all. And I want to focus on those really early adopters, those innovator types who already recognize they have a problem. And that's where like the early adopter pyramid comes in, because you can say these people who have the problem, know that they have the problem, they're looking for a solution, they're desperate for one, they've hacked one together, and they have a budget. And when you go through that cycle there, you can kind of wedge into, this is the particular audience that already knows they have a problem. On the flip side, if it's not just a question of market stage, if it's actually just an unknown problem, then this is a really difficult market to get into. And so that doesn't mean that it's wrong or doesn't mean that it's bad, but it does mean that it's a lot longer to profitability. Your sales process is considerably more difficult, and it actually takes quite a bit of market preparation and work to get there, which means you're probably going to lose cash for years before you actually get there. And that's it's a thing, you can do it. It's not necessarily what I recommend. It's a moonshot type of business, but it's totally doable. So that's roughly how I would think about that question. But you really want to find, like, if you want to get a startup that gets profitable, that you can do an exit in a few years, something like that, then you want to find a problem that people are really feeling very severely, that is also urgent. So that urgent severity is where you get high prices, where you get really fast adoption, and you can really just crush it in the marketplace. So there's that. Great. Cool. So the next question I told you was kind of related to this. So let me throw this next question. So this has to do with a two-sided market. So it said, I want to build a two-sided platform, and how do I prove like both sides? So now we're getting to something weird, right? Because I can't just put one thing in front of somebody, and like, how do I negotiate that process where I want to build a two-sided platform? And I'll ignore the details of the two-sided platform because I don't have their permission to talk about it here. But it doesn't really matter. We'll still get through it. No problem here. So when you're doing a two-sided platform, we want to prove both sides before you ever actually build anything. And because two-sided platforms are hard, right? And you always have a chicken and egg thing, right? So if you think of like Airbnb, the property owners want to go where the customers are, and the customers want to go where the property owners are. But at the beginning, you have neither. So why would I list when there are no customers? And why would I go search for something if there are no places to rent, right? And so you get this chicken and egg problem. And like, how do you convince people to go first? It's like a perennial problem in the two-sided market space. For this reason, two-sided markets are very, very, very difficult. So So before you do anything, you want to actually prove that that two sides are at least there, and you have those two sides right and dialed in, and that you have customers sort of ready at the start. And a really great example for how to do this with this combination of prototyping and experimentation is a story I actually just learned the other day from a friend of mine about masterclass. And so how they got started, and this I might get all the details wrong because I'm just kind of hearsay here, but the point is relevant and valid. So founder there said, okay, so I want to build this thing where we teach people to cook online. That's kind of the approach here. And so I'm going to need to get some like real chefs to do this, but they're not going to go there unless there are people there. And so I need to get the people, and how do I go about that? So he said, got it. So he went to customers, went to the end people who actually want to learn from a real chef how to cook. How to learn to cook from them. They said, if we got, chef A, chef B, chef C, whatever, but if we got a set of chefs to teach, these courses, basically, is this something that you'd sign up for? And of course, you can't ask it like that. I've talked, a lot of times about that. So they did early validation. They kind of narrowed in on what that would look like. And then at the call to action for the would you actually buy this was collecting information, and not just email address, name, email address, physical address, like the mailing address, the phone number, and so forth, collecting all of this information from them based on this assumption that the more data that you provide, the more compelling it is that I'm actually interested. Like, you throw your email address in anything, you can always unsubscribe, right? But how are you going to give all that information if you're not actually interested? Right. And so it's not as compelling as money, but it's interesting. And at this point, you don't know really what the business model is even going to be. And so it's kind of hard to figure out how do I even collect money on that? And it's a whole thing. Right. And B2C is much harder to do those pre-sales on if you're not crowdfunding. So, okay, so now we have a little bit of data there. So then he took this list of, it was definitely more than 1,000, but he took this big list of all these consumers just waiting to have their money taken to be taught by chefs. Then he went to the chefs and he said, okay, so here we go. I've got for you this people, they are just ready to go. I got all these customers. They are ready to go. They want to take a class from you. And then you talk to them about and did validation. And that said about what would it take to actually do this? Like, how can I make the business model, this two-sided thing work? What kind of compensation are the chefs going to need to get through all of that? And then went through that process to get them to say yes, to get them on board. Then you get those chefs to essentially sign an LOI or the equivalent of an LOI to say that they'll develop this class if the platform exists. So now you have people waiting to use it. You have chefs waiting to use it. You've got both sides there. And all you need is the middle piece, which is the software for the marketplace. And that's the easy part. Like, software is easy, product's easy. All things being equal, it's easy. That's not to say that there aren't hard parts to it, and growing and scaling comes with all kinds of technical challenges, but the actual software part, like figuring out how to do that, is the easy part. So then he said, okay, I got all this robust evidence from both sides of the market, then took that to investors and say, all I have to do is build the thing. Right. And so of course he got funding in order to build that. So if you want to prove a two-sided market, prove them independently and find that chain to see if you can actually get customers or the equivalent of customers in advance, ready to go before you ever think about the platform. And you can see why that actually connects to the first part there. So that's roughly how I would think about that. Both of these questions are pretty similar in terms of how you approach that. I will actually be talking about this sort of process a bit more detail in my email newsletter on Monday. So Monday's issue comes out in just a few days if you're watching this live. That's all going to be about how you take an idea for a startup and then go and test that in the real world. How do you actually take that from your head into real thing? What that process look like? So if you want, you can sign up for that newsletter right over here. And we'll get that going. Okay, so there was a question here from June. I had my OKRs wrong. I should have been the cohort as an objective. And it drove me crazy, but now I'm on the right track. Glad to see you're on the right track. Feel free to drop more detail in the chat there, but super glad to hear you're finally on figuring you're on the right track there. So our question of the day, just to return to that, was pitch me your startup ideas. Not really a question, more of a command, I suppose. But drop what you're working on in the chat, and I will come back and attack it, shred it, encourage it, maybe all of the above, but we'll get some dialogue going about your idea. Happy to engage in what you guys are working on there. And I will be back next Thursday. That'll be November 3rd, 10 a.m. We'll be right here to talk more about startups and traction. If you have a question, hit the link in the description, which is this one right here. Drop this link into your browser, load a little page. You can write, you can record, you can do a video, ask me a question. If you do a video, I'll actually play it on the air. So that's that. Make sure, appreciate it if you'd give a little like here, if you are having a good time. And with that, I think we are going to kind of wrap it up. Great to see you as well, June. Hope to see you in the cohort as well. So yeah, that's it. Thanks so much for joining. Have a fantastic rest of your Thursday, a great weekend, and I will see you guys next week.